The red dust of Arcturus Prime swirled in angry circles as another mining drill broke down for the third time this week. Tom Bradley wiped grease from his hands and cursed under his breath. The colony of Haven's Edge was barely holding together, and every broken machine made their survival a little more uncertain. Tom had been the colony's chief engineer for 2 years now, ever since he'd left his military service on Earth behind. The job promised good pay and a fresh start on a frontier world. What the recruitment office hadn't mentioned were the shadow maws. These creatures haunted the colonists' nightmares. Standing 7 feet tall on their hind legs, with razor-sharp claws and teeth that could crush metal, they were the undisputed rulers of Arcturus Prime. Their black fur absorbed light like living darkness, making them nearly invisible in the planet's frequent twilight hours. Worse than their size or strength was their intelligence. The shadow maws hunted in coordinated packs, set traps, and seemed to understand human behavior better than humans understood theirs. Tom finished his repairs just as the emergency siren began wailing across the settlement. He dropped his tools and ran toward the main compound, where colonists were already gathering behind the reinforced walls. Administrator Reed Walsh stood on the command platform, his face grim as he addressed. "The crowd. Another attack last night," Walsh announced. "The Henderson family's farm. They're safe, but we lost most of their livestock." Angry murmurs rippled through the crowd. "That's the 4th attack this month. Something's got these creatures more aggressive than usual." Tom listened to the complaints and fears of his fellow colonists. Most wanted to organize hunting parties, set more traps, or call for military support from Earth. The same solutions they'd tried before with limited success. What bothered Tom wasn't just the attacks themselves, but the pattern behind them. Over the past few weeks, he'd noticed changes in Shadow Maw behavior. The pack's usual hunting routes had shifted. Their calls, which normally echoed through the valleys at dawn and dusk, had become more frequent and desperate sounding. Most telling of all, the attacks seemed focused on the eastern section of the colony, as if the creatures were searching for something rather than simply hunting for food. "We need better defenses," Walsh continued. "Bradley, I want you to reinforce the eastern perimeter, double the fence height, and add more sensor arrays." Tom nodded, but his mind was already working on the puzzle. Why the eastern perimeter? What made that section different? As the crowd dispersed, he made his way to the colony's observation post, a converted water tower that offered a clear view of the surrounding landscape. Through his binoculars, Tom studied the terrain beyond the settlement. The eastern side backed up to a series of rocky hills and deep ravines, perfect hiding spots for shadow maws. But it was also where the old mining operations had left dozens of abandoned structures scattered across the landscape. Storage sheds, equipment bunkers, and worker shelters dotted the area like metal scars on the red soil. A movement caught his eye. There, on a ridge about a mile out, stood a massive female shadow maw. Even at this distance, Tom could see her distinctive white markings along her muzzle and the battle scars that marked her as the pack's alpha. The colonists called her Kira, though Tom doubted she'd appreciate the human name. But something was wrong with her posture. Instead of the confident stance of a successful predator, Kira appeared agitated, almost frantic. Her head moved constantly, scanning the landscape with urgent, jerky motions. She let out a long, mournful howl that sent chills down Tom's spine. It wasn't the hunting call he'd learned to recognize. This sound carried something else entirely. Grief. Tom watched for another hour as Kira moved through the hills, stopping at various points to call out again. Each howl seemed more desperate than the last. Finally, she disappeared into one of the deeper ravines, but Tom could still hear her calls echoing off the rocks. That evening, as he worked to install new sensors along the eastern fence, Tom's thoughts kept returning to Kira's behavior. His military training had taught him to observe and analyze enemy patterns, but this felt different. The alpha female wasn't acting like a predator planning an attack. She was acting like something else entirely. The next morning brought troubling news. Pete Morris, one of the colony's scouts, reported fresh shadow maw tracks throughout the eastern hills. But they were strange. Instead of the purposeful hunting patterns they'd learned to recognize, these tracks seemed random, circular, as if the creatures were searching rather than stalking. "Found something else weird, too," Pete added, showing Tom a collection of claw marks on a metal storage shed. "These gouges are fresh, but look at the pattern. It's like she was trying to get inside, not mark territory." Tom examined the scratches carefully. Pete was right. These weren't territorial markings or attack damage. They were the desperate scratchings of a creature trying to access something inside the building. The pieces of the puzzle began forming a picture Tom didn't want to believe. The frantic howling, the desperate searching, the focus on areas with hiding places. Kira wasn't hunting. She was looking for something she'd lost. That night, Tom made a decision that would have horrified his fellow colonists. Instead of heading home after his shift, he grabbed a portable scanner and headed toward the eastern perimeter. If Kira was searching for something in the abandoned structures, he needed to know what it was. The twin moons of Arcturus Prime provided enough light for Tom to navigate between the scattered buildings. His scanner picked up various metal signatures from old equipment, but nothing unusual. He was about to give up when he approached a storage facility about half a mile from the colony fence. The building's door hung slightly open, and fresh shadow maw tracks surrounded it. Tom's heart pounded. As he approached, every instinct telling him to turn back. But curiosity and a growing sense of understanding pushed him forward. Inside the shed, his flashlight beam revealed 3 small shapes huddled in the corner. At first, Tom thought they were some kind of native wildlife. Then he saw the distinctive black fur and realized the truth. 3 shadow maw cubs, probably no more than a few weeks old, lay shivering in the abandoned building. They were thin, clearly hungry, and their eyes held the dull look of creatures near death. These weren't the monsters that haunted colonist nightmares. They were just babies, lost and afraid. Tom understood everything now. Kira's desperate searching, the changed behavior patterns, the focus on hiding places. The alpha female had lost her cubs, and she was slowly going mad with grief trying to find them. The cubs stirred at his presence, too weak to flee, but not yet afraid. Tom faced a choice that would change everything. He could return to the colony, report the discovery, and watch as his fellow humans eliminated 3 helpless creatures. Or he could do something that defied every rule of survival on Arcturus Prime. He reached out slowly, and one of the cubs didn't pull away from his touch. 3 days had passed since Tom first found the cubs, and he had become a criminal by colony standards. Every morning he told Administrator Walsh he was checking fence repairs. Every evening he returned with reports of progress on the eastern perimeter defenses. What he didn't report was the makeshift nursery he'd created in the abandoned storage shed. The cubs had been near death when he found them. The smallest one, which he'd started calling Scout, had barely been breathing. Tom had no experience caring for alien predators, but his engineering mind approached the problem like any other technical challenge. The cubs needed warmth, food, and safety. Everything else he could figure out as he went. Creating a heat source had been his first priority. Using spare parts from broken mining equipment, Tom rigged up a small thermal generator that kept the shed warm without producing detectable energy signatures that might alert colony sensors. For food, he'd started small, bringing protein bars and water. To his surprise, the cubs had accepted the human food, though they clearly preferred the fresh meat he began smuggling from the colony's food stores. Scout was the smallest and weakest of the 3, but also the most curious. Despite her size, she showed a sharp intelligence that reminded Tom uncomfortably of human children. She watched his every movement with bright yellow eyes and had learned to recognize the sound of his approaching footsteps. The middle cub, who Tom called Hunter due to his more aggressive eating habits, was the strongest physically, but seemed content to let Scout make decisions for the group. The third cub, Shadow, was the most cautious, always staying slightly back, when Tom entered their space. By the second day, the cubs had grown strong enough to move around the shed freely. Tom had expected them to try escaping, but instead they seemed to accept his presence as natural. When he sat down to check his equipment, they would gather nearby, watching him work with intense concentration. Their behavior challenged everything the colonists believed about Shadowmaw intelligence and social structure. The real breakthrough came on the third night, when the planet's temperature dropped below freezing. Tom arrived at the shed to find all three cubs shivering despite the thermal generator. Scout was making small whimpering sounds that cut straight through his heart. The heating unit was working, but it wasn't enough to keep the young creatures warm in the planet's harsh climate. Tom faced another impossible decision. The cubs would die from hypothermia if they didn't get additional warmth soon. The logical solution was obvious, but it required him to trust creatures that every human on Arcturus Prime considered deadly predators. He turned off his flashlight and lay down on the shed's floor, using his body heat as a supplemental heat source. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then Scout cautiously approached, pressing her small form against his side. Hunter followed, settling against Tom's other side. Shadow remained distant for several minutes before finally joining her siblings. The cubs' body temperature was lower than humans, but their fur was surprisingly soft. Tom could feel their rapid heartbeats gradually slowing as they warmed up. Despite every survival instinct screaming at him, he found himself relaxing. These weren't the monsters from colonist horror stories. They were just frightened children who needed help. Tom must have dozed off because he woke to early morning sunlight streaming through cracks in the shed walls. All three cubs were sleeping peacefully on his chest, their breathing deep and steady. Scout had somehow worked her way up to rest her head near his shoulder, while Hunter and Shadow flanked his sides like living blankets. The scene should have terrified him. Instead, Tom felt a strange sense of rightness, as if he'd discovered something important about the relationship between humans and Shadowmaws that no one else understood. These creatures weren't mindless killing machines. They were intelligent, emotional beings capable of trust and affection. Over the following days, Tom's secret became increasingly difficult to maintain. The cubs grew stronger and more active, requiring more food and attention. Their playful behavior reminded him of puppies, if puppies had claws that could shred metal and teeth designed for tearing flesh. But they never showed aggression toward him, even during feeding time when their predatory instincts were strongest. The cubs also demonstrated problem-solving abilities that amazed Tom. When he accidentally left his tool bag outside their reach, Scout figured out how to stack debris to climb high enough to knock it down. Hunter learned to open the simple latches Tom had installed on their food storage containers. Shadow, despite her cautious nature, showed remarkable memory, always knowing exactly where Tom had placed each piece of equipment. More surprisingly, they began showing signs of attachment to their human caregiver. When Tom arrived each day, all three cubs would rush to greet him with enthusiastic vocalizations that sounded nothing like the terrifying howls that echoed through the colony at night. When he prepared to leave, they would follow him to the door and watch sadly as he departed. The situation became complicated when Dr. Amy Foster, the colony's chief medical officer, noticed Tom's unusual behavior. She'd observed him making frequent trips outside the main compound and noticed his increased consumption of protein rations. When she casually mentioned these observations during a medical checkup, Tom realized his secret was in danger of discovery. "You're showing signs of stress, Tom," Dr. Foster said, checking his blood pressure. "Elevated heart rate, irregular sleep patterns, increased caloric intake. Are you having trouble with the Shadowmaw situation?" Many colonists are experiencing anxiety about the recent attacks. Tom forced himself to remain calm. "Just working extra hours on the perimeter defenses. Want to make sure we're prepared if they escalate their behavior. But Dr. Foster's sharp eyes missed nothing. She'd noticed the small scratches on his hands. From playing with the cubs, the way he flinched when other colonists mentioned hunting parties, and his defensive reactions to discussions about Shadowmaw elimination, she was building a profile of someone hiding something significant. Meanwhile, Kira's desperate searching continued throughout the hills. Her howls had become a nightly soundtrack to colony life, growing more anguished with each passing day. Other Shadowmaws had joined her search, and the entire pack's behavior had shifted from their normal hunting patterns to something resembling a massive search and rescue operation. Tom knew the situation couldn't continue indefinitely. The cubs were growing rapidly, and soon they would be too large to hide effectively. More concerning was the effect their disappearance was having on their mother. Kira's grief was driving her to take increasing risks, bringing her closer to the colony each night. Sooner or later, her desperation would lead to a confrontation that could destroy any chance of peaceful coexistence. On the evening of the 7th day, Tom arrived at the shed to find the cubs more active than usual. They greeted him with unusual excitement, making soft chirping sounds he'd never heard before. Scout immediately climbed into his lap, while Hunter and Shadow pressed close to his sides. As Tom settled in for what had become their evening routine, he realized something had fundamentally changed. The cubs weren't just accepting his presence anymore. They had bonded with him as surely as they would have bonded with their biological mother. In trying to save their lives, he had accidentally become their adoptive parent. The weight of this realization was overwhelming. These weren't pets or temporary charges. They were intelligent beings who now saw him as family. Whatever happened next, Tom knew there was no going back to the simple world where humans and Shadowmaws were natural enemies. Outside the shed, Kira's howls echoed through the night, closer than ever before. Tom held the sleeping cubs and wondered how long he could keep them safe from both the colony's fear and their mother's desperate love. 2 weeks into his secret guardianship, Tom discovered that Shadowmaw cubs were far more intelligent than anyone had imagined. Scout had learned to recognize over a dozen human words, responding appropriately when Tom said food, water, or careful. Hunter could solve puzzles that would challenge most Earth animals, while Shadow displayed an emotional intelligence that sometimes left Tom speechless. The breakthrough came when Tom accidentally cut his hand on a sharp piece of metal while repairing their shelter. As blood dripped from the wound, all 3 cubs immediately approached with obvious concern. Scout gently licked the injury, her rough tongue actually helping to clean the cut. Hunter brought Tom a piece of clean cloth that had somehow ended up in their bedding, while Shadow positioned herself between Tom and the sharp metal that had caused the injury. Their behavior wasn't instinctual predator response. It was genuine care for someone they considered part of their family. Tom's double life became increasingly complex as the cubs grew. They now stood nearly 3 feet tall and weighed close to 60 pounds each. Their appetite had increased dramatically, requiring Tom to smuggle larger quantities of meat from the colony stores. More challenging was their need for exercise and stimulation. Keeping 3 intelligent, energetic predator cubs confined to a storage shed was like trying to contain small earthquakes. The solution came from Scout's natural curiosity. She had discovered that the shed's ventilation system connected to a network of maintenance tunnels running beneath the abandoned mining facility. The tunnels were too small for adult Shadowmaws, but perfect for cubs who needed space to run and play. Tom spent his evenings exploring these tunnels with his adoptive children, marveling at their natural agility and coordination. The cubs treated these excursions like games, racing through passages, playing elaborate versions of hide-and-seek, and practicing hunting behaviors on imaginary prey. Their joy was infectious, and Tom found himself laughing more than he had in years. But games also revealed the developing predators within. Hunter's playful pounces carried real force now, enough to knock Tom off balance. Shadow's stealth abilities were becoming genuinely impressive, allowing her to disappear completely in the tunnel shadows. Scout's problem-solving skills had evolved, to the point where she could navigate complex route changes and remember dozens of tunnel intersections. These weren't pets playing at being dangerous. They were apex predators learning their trade, and Tom was their primary teacher, whether he intended to be or not. The situation reached a crisis point when Administrator Walsh announced a colony-wide security meeting. Tom sat in the main hall, with his fellow colonists, trying to appear normal, while his mind raced with worry about the cubs he'd left sleeping in their hidden shelter. "The Shadow Maw situation has escalated beyond acceptable parameters," Walsh announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "Their search patterns are bringing them closer to our perimeter every night. Yesterday, sensors detected movement within 200 meters of the main gate." Tom's blood ran cold. 200 meters was dangerously close to the cub's location. "I'm implementing Protocol 7, Walsh continued. "Effective. Immediately, all non-essential personnel will remain within the inner compound after sunset. Security teams will begin active patrols of the outer perimeter with authorization to engage any Shadow Maw on site." The room erupted in nervous chatter. Protocol 7 was the colony's emergency lockdown procedure, reserved for immediate threats to settlement survival. It also meant that Tom's access to the cubs would be severely restricted or eliminated entirely. Dr. Foster raised her hand. "Administrator, I've been monitoring stress indicators among our population. The constant threat is affecting mental health colony-wide. Perhaps we should consider more aggressive solutions." "What kind of solutions?" Walsh asked. "Poisoned bait. Stations. We know they're searching the area systematically. We could use that behavior against them." Tom's hands clenched involuntarily. The idea of poisoning Kira's pack, especially when he knew she was only trying to find her missing children, was unbearable. But speaking out would raise questions he couldn't answer. "The ecological impact could be severe," offered Dr. Sam North, the colony's environmental specialist. "We don't fully understand their role in the local ecosystem." "I understand the concern," Walsh replied, "but our priority has to be human safety. Foster, prepare preliminary plans for bait deployment. We'll implement if the situation deteriorates further." As the meeting dispersed, Tom felt trapped between impossible choices. He couldn't let the colonists poison Kira's pack, but he also couldn't reveal the cubs without putting them in mortal danger. His fellow humans had lived in fear of Shadow Maws for too long to accept that these creatures were capable of trust, affection, or peaceful coexistence. The solution came from an unexpected source. That night, as Tom sat in the tunnels with the cubs, Scout approached him with something in her mouth. At first, he thought she'd caught some small animal, but when she dropped her prize at his feet, Tom saw it was his missing work glove. The glove had disappeared 3 days ago while he was installing new sensors. Tom had assumed he'd dropped it somewhere in the colony, but Scout had apparently retrieved it from wherever he'd lost it and kept it safe. When he reached for the glove, Scout stepped back and made a series of soft vocalizations that sounded almost like speech. Hunter and Shadow immediately responded to Scout's sounds, approaching with their own items. Hunter carried Tom's broken flashlight, which had been missing for over a week. Shadow presented a small metal tool Tom recognized as part of his emergency repair kit. The cubs weren't just returning his possessions, they were trying to communicate something important. As Tom examined each item, he realized they all had one thing in common. They were objects he'd handled recently, items that carried his scent. Scout made her vocalization again, and this time, Tom heard something familiar in the sound. It was similar to the long-distance calls adult Shadow Maws used to communicate across the hills, but higher-pitched and more complex. The cubs weren't just making noise, they were trying to teach him their language. Over the following nights, Tom began learning basic Shadow Maw communication. The cubs were patient teachers, repeating sounds until he could approximate their vocalizations. Scout was the most vocal, with an extensive vocabulary of chirps, growls, and howls that conveyed different meanings. Hunter preferred physical communication, using body language and gentle touches to express his thoughts. Shadow combined both approaches, creating complex messages through sound and movement combinations. Through this primitive language exchange, Tom began to understand the cubs' emotional state. They were content in their hidden shelter, but they missed their mother and their pack. They recognized Tom as their protector and provider, but they also knew he wasn't truly one of them. Most importantly, they understood that the world outside their shelter was dangerous, and that their survival depended on remaining hidden. The breakthrough in communication came with consequences Tom hadn't anticipated. As the cubs learned to express themselves more clearly, their emotional needs became more apparent. They weren't just physically dependent on him anymore. They had formed genuine emotional attachments that went beyond simple survival instinct. Scout had become his shadow, following him everywhere within their limited space and showing signs of separation anxiety when he prepared to leave each evening. Hunter displayed protective behaviors, positioning himself between Tom and anything he perceived as potential threats, including sudden noises or unfamiliar scents. Shadow had developed what could only be described as affection, seeking physical contact and purring contentedly when Tom scratched behind her ears. The cubs weren't just surviving under his care. They were thriving, growing into intelligent, emotionally complex individuals who had bonded with their human caregiver as surely as human children bond with their parents. But outside their hidden sanctuary, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Kira's nightly searches had brought her pack within sight of the colony walls. Her howls of grief and desperation echoed through the settlement, driving the human population to the edge of panic. Walsh had authorized round-the-clock security patrols, and Dr. Foster had begun preparing her poisoned bait stations. Tom knew that time was running out. Soon, he would have to choose between the cubs' safety and his fellow humans' survival. The innocent creatures sleeping peacefully in his arms didn't know that their very existence was about to become the catalyst for a conflict that could destroy everything he'd worked to build. The discovery happened by accident, like most important revelations in Tom's life. He was teaching Scout a new hand signal when the cub suddenly froze, her ears swiveling toward the shed's entrance. Hunter and Shadow immediately joined her in alert postures, their bodies tense with anticipation rather than fear. Before Tom could react, they heard it too, a long, mournful howl echoing across the hills. Scout responded with a complex series of vocalizations that Tom had learned meant mother and searching. But this time, her calls carried something else: recognition, longing, and what sounded remarkably like an attempt to provide location information. Tom's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. The cubs were trying to call back to their pack. He quickly moved to quiet them, but the damage was done. In the distance, Kira's howls changed tone, becoming more urgent and directional. She had heard her children's voices and was moving toward their location. For the first time in 3 weeks, Tom felt genuine fear of his adoptive charges. Not because they had suddenly become dangerous, but because their natural instincts threatened to expose everything he'd built. The cubs wanted to reunite with their birth family, and he couldn't blame them for that desire. But their reunion would mean discovery, and discovery would mean death for all of them. The crisis escalated over the following days. Kira's pack had pinpointed the general area of the cubs' location and began systematic searches of every structure within a 2-mile radius. Their behavior had shifted from desperate wandering to focused hunting, and they were closing in fast. Inside the colony, Administrator Walsh declared a state of emergency. Dr. Foster's poison bait stations were deployed throughout the eastern hills, despite Dr. North's environmental concerns. Security teams were armed with heavy weapons and authorized to shoot on sight. The colonists' fear had reached a breaking point, and any shadow maw that came within sensor range would be eliminated immediately. Tom found himself caught between two forces racing toward a catastrophic collision. The cubs, now nearly full-grown and increasingly restless, wanted nothing more than to rejoin their family. The colonists, driven by months of fear and sleepless nights, were prepared to wipe out anything that threatened their survival. The situation became unbearable when Tom arrived at the shed one evening to find it empty. His heart stopped as he frantically searched the interior space, calling the cubs names in both human words and the shadow maw vocalizations they'd taught him. The heating unit was still running. Their bedding was undisturbed, but Scout, Hunter, and Shadow were gone. Tom forced himself to think logically. The cubs knew the tunnel system better than he did, and they'd shown increasing interest in exploring areas beyond their usual territory. They might have simply gone on a longer excursion than normal. But as minutes turned to hours without their return, Tom began to fear the worst. He was preparing to venture into the tunnels when he heard familiar vocalizations coming from outside the shed. Scout's voice, but different somehow. More mature, more confident. Tom cautiously opened the shed door and stepped into the Arcturus Prime night. All three cubs stood in the clearing beyond the shed, but they weren't alone. Kira stood 20 meters away, her massive form clearly visible in the moonlight. For the first time since Tom had begun observing her behavior, the alpha female looked calm. Her posture showed none of the frantic desperation that had marked her recent activities. Instead, she appeared focused entirely on her reunited children. The cubs moved between their birth mother and their adoptive father, clearly torn between two different but equally powerful attachments. Scout approached Tom first, nuzzling against his legs in the affectionate gesture he'd grown to love. But when Kira made a low, rumbling sound, Scout immediately returned to her mother's side. Tom stood perfectly still, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger the confrontation he'd been dreading. Kira had found her cubs, but she'd also found the human who had been caring for them. In the wild, male animals who interfered with another's offspring rarely survived the encounter. But Kira's response defied every expectation Tom had about shadow maw behavior. The alpha female approached, slowly, her yellow eyes never leaving Tom's face. When she was close enough that Tom could feel her warm breath, she stopped and made a series of low vocalizations. The sounds were similar to the communication patterns the cubs had taught him, but deeper and more complex. Scout responded to her mother's calls, adding her own vocalizations that Tom recognized as the words she'd learned for safe, warm, and food. Hunter joined the conversation, his deeper voice carrying tones that seemed to describe their daily routines and play sessions. Shadow, true to her cautious nature, remained silent but positioned herself where she could see both Tom and Kira clearly. The exchange continued for several minutes, with the cubs apparently describing their experiences to their mother in remarkable detail. Tom couldn't understand everything they were communicating, but the overall message was clear. The cubs were telling Kira that Tom had cared for them, protected them, and treated them with kindness. When the conversation ended, Kira fixed her attention back on Tom. For a long moment, predator and human studied each other in silence. Then, in a gesture that would have seemed impossible just hours before, Kira lowered her massive head in what could only be described as a bow of acknowledgement. Tom's mind reeled as he processed what was happening. Kira wasn't just retrieving her cubs. She was expressing gratitude to the human who had kept them alive. The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching vehicles. Colony security had detected the shadow maw presence and was responding in force. Tom could see lights moving through the hills, and the sound of heavy weapons being readied carried clearly in the still air. Kira immediately shifted back into protective mode, positioning herself between the approaching threats and her cubs. But instead of fleeing, She looked directly at Tom and made a questioning vocalization. She was asking for his help. Tom faced the most important decision of his life. He could call out to the security team, identify himself, and try to explain the situation. But would they believe him? Would they care that Kira had shown gratitude and intelligence? Or would they simply see a deadly predator threatening a human colonist and respond with overwhelming force? The cubs sensed the tension and began moving restlessly. Scout approached Tom again, her eyes reflecting her confusion about the sudden change in atmosphere. Hunter positioned himself near his mother, ready to follow her lead. Shadow, always the most perceptive of the three, seemed to understand that something terrible was about to happen. As the security lights grew brighter and the sound of weapons charging reached their position, Tom made his choice. Instead of calling out to his fellow humans, he stepped forward and placed his hand on Kira's massive shoulder. The alpha female looked at him with surprise, then understanding. Tom was choosing to stand with her rather than against her. But even as he made this gesture of alliance, Tom knew it might not be enough. The colonists were armed with military-grade weapons and driven by months of accumulated fear. Kira was powerful, but she was also focused on protecting her cubs rather than fighting humans. The confrontation that was about to unfold would determine not just their immediate survival, but the future relationship between humans and Shadow Maws on Arcturus Prime. Tom had spent weeks learning that these creatures were capable of intelligence, emotion, and even gratitude. Now he would discover whether his fellow humans were capable of the same understanding. In the distance, Administrator Walsh's voice echoed through a loudspeaker, demanding that any colonists in the area identify themselves immediately. Tom looked at Kira, at the cubs who had become his family, and at the lights that represented everything he'd once called home. The choice was no longer his to make alone. The security lights found them before Tom could make another decision. 6 armed colonists emerged from behind the rocky outcroppings, their weapons trained on Kira and her cubs. Tom stood between 2 worlds, his hand still resting on the alpha female's shoulder, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether anyone survived the encounter. "Bradley!" Administrator Walsh's voice cracked with disbelief as he stepped into the light. "Get away from that creature immediately!" Tom didn't move. "She's not going to hurt anyone, Reed. These are her cubs. She's been searching for them." "Those are the missing cubs?" Dr. Foster appeared behind Walsh, her medical scanner already active. "Tom, those creatures will be full-grown predators in a matter of weeks. Where have you been keeping them?" Before Tom could answer, Scout made the decision for him. The young female approached the nearest colonist, Dr. North, and sat down in a posture Tom recognized as her way of showing she wasn't a threat. Her action was so obviously peaceful that North actually lowered his weapon slightly. "She's trying to communicate," North said in amazement. "Look at her body language. This isn't aggressive behavior." Hunter and Shadow followed Scout's example, positioning themselves where the colonists could see them clearly, but maintaining non-threatening postures. Kira watched her children's actions with obvious approval, then made a series of low vocalizations that Tom had learned meant safe and friend. "They're talking to us," Tom said, his voice carrying the wonder he'd felt during his first weeks with the cubs. "They understand what's happening, and they're trying to show you they're not dangerous." Walsh kept his weapon raised. "Bradley, you've lost your mind. These are apex predators. They've killed our livestock, terrorized our families. They've been searching for their children," Tom interrupted. "Every attack, every approach to the colony, it was Kira trying to find Scout, Hunter, and Shadow. She wasn't hunting us. She was looking for them." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with the colonists maintaining their defensive positions while the Shadow Maws remained passive. Tom found himself serving as translator, explaining the cubs' behaviors and vocalizations to humans, who had never imagined these creatures were capable of complex communication. The situation changed when Scout approached Dr. Foster directly. The cub carried something in her mouth. Tom's missing medical kit, which had disappeared from the shed weeks ago. Scout placed the kit at Foster's feet and stepped back, making soft chirping sounds. "She's returning your equipment," Tom explained. "The cubs have been collecting things that belong to me, things that carry my scent. They understand ownership and respect." Dr. Foster knelt down and examined the medical kit. It was undamaged, carefully preserved despite weeks in Shadowmaw custody. "This changes things," she said quietly. "They've been protecting your belongings, not destroying them." The breakthrough came when Hunter demonstrated his problem-solving abilities. One of the security team's equipment packs had fallen during their approach, spilling tools across the rocky ground. Without being asked, Hunter began collecting the scattered items and organizing them into neat piles according to type. His actions were methodical, intelligent, and clearly helpful rather than threatening. "My God," Dr. North whispered. "They're more intelligent than we thought possible." Walsh remained skeptical, but Tom could see doubt creeping into his expression. Even if they're intelligent, they're still dangerous. One adult Shadowmaw could kill half our security team. "Then why haven't they?" Tom challenged. "Kira could have attacked the moment your team arrived. Instead, she's showing you that she understands this is a peaceful encounter. Her cubs are demonstrating their intelligence and good intentions. They're trying to prove they're not the monsters you think they are." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the colony's sensor array. Pete Morris's voice crackled through Walsh's radio with news that changed everything. "Administrator, we've got massive movement on the northern perimeter. Unknown. Shadowmaw pack, at least 20 individuals, approaching fast. These aren't the locals we've been tracking. They're bigger, more aggressive, and they're heading straight for the main compound." Kira's reaction was immediate and telling. She raised her head and released a howl that was completely different from her previous calls. This sound carried warning, danger, and unmistakable alarm. The cubs responded by moving closer to their mother, their relaxed postures shifting to high alert, Tom translated based on his weeks of learning their communication. "She's warning us. This new pack is dangerous even to her. That's why she's been searching so desperately for her cubs. She wasn't just grieving, she was trying to get them to safety before this rival pack arrived." The implications hit everyone. Simultaneously, the recent attacks hadn't been random predation or territorial aggression. Kira's pack had been defending their territory, and by extension, the human colony, from a much more dangerous threat. Her desperate searches for the cubs had been driven by the knowledge that worse predators were coming. Walsh's tactical mind processed the information quickly. "How long do we have?" Morris's voice was tight with fear. "At their current speed, maybe 30 minutes before they reach the outer perimeter. Sir, these creatures are bigger than anything we've ever seen. Our current defenses won't hold them." Tom looked at Kira, understanding passing between them without words. The alpha female's pack was smaller but more familiar with the local terrain. Her cubs were young but intelligent and could help coordinate between species. Most importantly, Kira had reason to protect the human settlement that had sheltered her children. "We can work together," Tom said, addressing both Walsh and Kira simultaneously. "Your pack knows this territory better than the invaders. We have weapons and fortified positions. Combined, we might be able to drive them off." The suggestion hung in the air like a live explosive. Humans and Shadowmaws working together was beyond anything the colonists had ever imagined. But the approaching threat left little time for philosophical debates about interspecies cooperation. Kira made the decision for all of them. She released a series of complex vocalizations that brought answering calls from the hills around them. Tom counted at least 8 different voices responding to her summons. The alpha female was calling in her entire pack for a coordinated defense. "She's agreeing to the alliance," Tom translated, "but we need to move fast. Her scouts report the enemy pack is larger and more aggressive than anything she's encountered before." The next 20 minutes transformed Haven's Edge from a terrified human settlement into the galaxy's first interspecies military cooperation. Tom served as primary translator, while Dr. North and Dr. Foster worked to understand Shadowmaw tactical communications. The Cubs proved invaluable as intermediaries, their ability to understand both human speech and Shadowmaw vocalizations, allowing them to relay complex strategic information between the two groups. Kira's pack took positions in the rocky hills overlooking the colony's northern approach, using their natural stealth and speed to create a mobile defensive screen. The human security teams fortified key positions with heavy weapons, providing range support for the Shadowmaw ground forces. The Cubs, despite their youth, served as communication relays, racing between positions to coordinate the defensive effort. When the enemy pack finally appeared, Tom understood why Kira had been so desperate to protect her territory. These Shadowmaws were massive, nearly half again as large as Kira's pack, with battle scars that spoke of countless violent encounters. They moved with the confidence of creatures that had never encountered effective resistance. The battle that followed lasted less than an hour, but it rewrote the history of human-Shadowmaw relations forever. The combined defense proved devastatingly effective. Human weapons provided suppressing fire that channeled the attackers into carefully prepared ambush points, while Kira's pack used their superior knowledge of local terrain to strike from unexpected angles. Scout, Hunter, and Shadow distinguished themselves by serving as battlefield coordinators, their unique position as trusted members of both communities, allowing them to relay tactical information with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Their intelligence and courage under fire impressed even the most skeptical colonists. When the enemy pack finally retreated, leaving several of their number dead on the battlefield, both humans and Shadowmaws had gained a new understanding of each other's capabilities and character. The aftermath brought changes that transformed Haven's Edge from a fearful frontier settlement into a beacon of interspecies cooperation. Administrator Walsh, pragmatist that he was, recognized the strategic value of an alliance with local apex predators. Dr. Foster began studying Shadowmaw physiology and intelligence, discovering cognitive abilities that rivaled many sentient species. Dr. North initiated ecological surveys that revealed the crucial role these creatures played in maintaining planetary balance. Tom found himself appointed as the colony's first interspecies relations coordinator, a position that formalized his role as translator and diplomat between humans and Shadowmaws. The Cubs, now approaching full adult size, became permanent residents of Haven's Edge, serving as ambassadors between their birth pack and their adoptive human family. 6 months later, Tom sat in his expanded workshop, reviewing reports from 3 other human colonies that had successfully negotiated peaceful coexistence agreements with their local Shadowmaw populations. The model developed at Haven's Edge was spreading throughout human space, transforming humanity's approach to alien contact from fear-based aggression to curiosity-driven cooperation. Scout, now a fully grown predator standing nearly 6 feet tall, rested her massive head on Tom's desk while he worked. Hunter and Shadow lounged nearby, their presence as natural as breathing after months of shared life. Through the workshop windows, Tom could see human children playing safely in areas that had once been deadly hunting grounds, protected by Shadowmaw guardians who understood that these small beings were precious to their human allies. The transformation had begun with a simple act of compassion, a human choosing to save 3 helpless cubs rather than eliminate potential threats. That choice had revealed truths about intelligence, emotion, and the possibility of understanding, between species that would have remained hidden if fear had prevailed over empathy. As evening approached and Kira's pack began their nightly patrol of the colony perimeter, Tom reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The galaxy was vast and full of creatures that humans didn't yet understand. But Haven's Edge had proven that with patience, compassion, and willingness to see beyond surface appearances, even the most unlikely alliances could flourish. Scout nuzzled his hand gently, and Tom scratched behind her ears the way she'd loved since cubhood. Outside, human and shadow maw voices mingled in the evening air, planning tomorrow's joint ventures and sharing stories of the day's adventures. The predator's cubs had indeed been found sleeping on a human's chest, but more importantly, that simple act of trust had awakened something far greater than anyone had imagined possible.